Here's a question for you. Can there be more than one winner?
If we're talking about a sports competition, the answer is no. By definition, if you are competing, then there is one thing you are competing for. Total victory. One winner and only one winner.
You are nothing!
But when it comes to life, does there always have to be a winner and a loser? Always the oppressor and always the oppressed? A lot of people think so.
There's always a loser.
But this guy had other ideas.
No, you fool. Everyone can be a winner.
What the heck are these guys arguing about? Today, we'll find out.
Today on TBH History, we're looking at how the Industrial Revolution progressed, the opposition that rose against it, and the economic debate that continues today around the world and right here in our own country.
Hey, I'm Lem.
And I'm Daniel.
And this is TBH History.
Last episode, we explored the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and how the world suddenly exploded with technological advancement. It was a wild time with new emerging technologies and few government restrictions to hold back the rapid changes. But with these drastic changes came new challenges.
And the question quickly became, what should the government's role be in addressing these challenges? A massive debate erupted over economics, a term for the way that society thinks about resources and money and wealth creation, that kind of stuff. Should the government step in with a heavy hand to control the market, such as socialism or communism? Or should it take a hands-off approach and allow a free market controlled by the private sector, such as capitalism?
An amazing number of world-changing inventions came about during the Industrial Revolution. But with a growing number of machines and factories, what we call industrialization, not only did it become possible to make things we couldn't make before, but it also revolutionized the way things were made. Everything from small household items to big machines began to be produced faster and cheaper.
This drastic change in how things were made could be seen as really good or really bad, depending on your perspective. The good was that it dramatically lowered the cost of things like clothes and tools and furniture. And goods that had once been considered luxury items were made more affordable than ever before. Also, new factory jobs created opportunities for employment to those who had long been desperate for work.
Oi, I've got a job! Rudolph, I can afford to feed you next week!
So what could possibly be bad about this? More jobs, better stuff at cheaper prices. Who can argue with that?
We're getting out of these straits, you bums! Ha!
Well, let's imagine an example. Let's say you had been a craftsman who had made furniture before industrialization, like your father before you, and his father before him. But then one day, a factory full of furniture-making machines shows up in your town. Sure, the furniture you sell is handmade and so beautiful, but you just can't produce furniture as quickly and cheaply as the factory.
If you don't drop your prices, most people will buy the cheaper factory-made furniture, and you won't make enough sales to stay in business. But if you do drop your prices, you say bye to your profits and may end up losing your business as a result. Either way, you're in a pickle. Traditional craftsmen, whose ways of life were threatened by new machines, pushed back against industrialization from the beginning. In groups called guilds, similarly skilled craftsmen, like all the furniture makers in an area, often banded together and tried to protect themselves from the competition of factories.
Guilds wanted the government to place rules on how things were made and regulations on how much items should cost in order to protect their jobs. They didn't like the free market system that was allowing the rapid changes in development to occur.
We're really upset!
They wanted a regulated or controlled market to halt industrialization. But it just didn't make sense on a large scale because so many lives were being improved by it.
Once it was apparent that these new machines were not going anywhere, vandalism, sabotage, and destruction became a common response by those whose traditional jobs were threatened by the new machines. Resistance reached a high point from 1811 through 1816 when a group called the Luddites secretly traveled through England destroying machines and factories.
Although they put up a strong fight, groups like the Luddites ultimately failed, and the Industrial Revolution marched on through the 19th century. Through free markets that allowed technological advancements to continue expanding, industrialization spread around the world to European colonies, and it naturally exploded in the United States, the nation that provided a prime example of capitalism, where citizens enjoyed more political and economic freedom than anywhere else in the world.
Through this time, more people were getting wealthy than ever before. And some leading industrialists became mind-bogglingly rich. Free markets combined with industrialization also dramatically reduced the poverty rate around the world and created an entire new group of people called the middle class, who the French called the bourgeoisie, as we learned in previous episodes.
But the growing industrial world was far from perfect. For capitalism to work and be an economic system where everyone can actually win, there needs to be competition in the market. Workers need to have the freedom to choose where they work, so that employers are forced to compete for their labor.
Which brings us to some important questions. What does it mean to have a free market? And what is capitalism? And how did these two working together, help the Industrial Revolution progress? Let's zoom out and take a look.
For centuries, the common belief regarding economics was that the earth had limited resources that had to be fought over, and only the strong and powerful would end up with a pile of goodies. Everyone else would suffer. More for you means less for me. There's only one winner and one loser, like some sort of arm wrestling contest. But the Industrial Revolution gave evidence that when it comes to economics, this way of thinking was wrong, and that wealth isn't something that has to be fought over, but can actually be created. In other words, through consensual transactions where both parties get something they want, it was possible to have situations where I win and you win. This is the beauty of capitalism and free markets, which brings us to this guy. He was a Scotsman by the name Adam Smith. In 1776, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's a complicated book, but the ideas are actually simple. Provide customers the goods and services they want, and they will happily pay a fair price. Pay employees fair wages for their labor, and they will happily work for you. But make a bad product, provide bad service, or be a bad boss, and people will go elsewhere. Through this competition, businesses are encouraged to provide better service, products, and employment in order to stay competitive. And in return, everyone is better off. To Smith, this model could only work where there is little government regulation, which is where capitalism comes in. And although capitalism has become a very controversial term, it's actually just a term for an economic system where a country's trade and industry are owned and controlled by the private sector, aka the people, instead of the government. And when you, as a private citizen, actually own your own business and property, you have the right to buy, sell, trade, and hire however you want. And it's this right to the ownership of your own property that lays the foundation for a free market to exist.
Unfortunately, during the Industrial Revolution, the world was changing so fast that sometimes there were places where more people needed jobs than there were jobs for them to fill. And this situation allowed some bosses and business owners to take advantage of their workers.
How would you like to work for me, huh? I pay diddly squat per hour. All right, sounds like a good deal. Good deal.
Many workers faced horrible working conditions, and they couldn't just quit their job and find a better one because oftentimes there weren't alternatives or other jobs for them to go to. So regardless of the bad conditions, they were stuck and had little power to make things better.
Hours were too long, pay was too little, and work environments were often unclean and unsafe. Miners and factory workers spent their days covered in soot and coal. Areas of beautiful countryside were damaged.
Oi, that's a lot of damage. Wow.
And cities like London were filled with waste.
Oi, that looks like chocolate petals.
I don't think that's chocolate.
These instances where capitalism was hijacked by corruption and abuse, and where freedom of choice was removed from the market, provided critics of industrialization with ammunition to attack. And in 1848, a German philosopher did just that. His name was Karl Marx, and he released a book titled The Communist Manifesto. Maybe you've heard of it, A lot of people have heard of it. Some people read it. Most people don't care.
In it, Marx argued against industrialization and capitalism. He believed that win-win relationships were impossible, that life was all one big fight for power, and that people were divided into two groups, the oppressed and the oppressors. Marx claimed that industrialized jobs, like working in a factory or a mine, were a new form of slavery. He believed that working low-skilled jobs in the industrialized world was worse than the lives poor people had before machines.
Dein Leben ist nicht besser.
And that capitalism would always lead to greedy bosses and mistreating their workers.
He was convinced that industrialization was so bad that workers would unite, violently overthrow their bosses, and create a new perfect world, or utopia, as we've mentioned in previous episodes. Utopia. It's a great thought. Although he thought this revolution was inevitable, he still hoped that workers of the world would listen to him and read his book.
You bum! Read the book!
And a lot of people did indeed hear Marx's message. The Communist Manifesto was translated into many languages, and word of the new philosophy of communism spread across Europe and the industrializing world. But in spite of this, his predictions failed to come true. While his ideas did attract a lot of followers, there weren't nearly enough for a revolution. You need at least like 3 or 4,000. The truth was, industrialization and free market capitalism were making the quality of life more comfortable for almost everyone. Although compared to some of the world's new wealthy capitalists, a lot of workers, they didn't have much compared to those people, but they still had more than ever before. And the risk of losing it certainly wasn't worth the fight.
Marx was correct that there was indeed some examples of greedy business owners mistreating their workers. But he was wrong that the evil deeds were a result of capitalism. Corruption and exploitation were results of a lack of competition in the market, not actually capitalism itself. And while industrialization did lead to poor working conditions for a time, eventually it was industrialized nations who led the way in outlawing slave labor and child labor and made laws that protected workers and the environment.
Marx spent the last 3 decades of his life trying to spread communism.
Buy the book and get one free schnitzel. Only today.
But most people saw it as a pack of lies about industrialization and capitalism and empty promises of a perfect world that could never be. And we'd all like utopia. We'd all like that perfect place, Marx didn't live long enough to see communism take hold anywhere.
Utopia is on the horizon.
But his ideas didn't die with him. Small groups of his followers, called Marxists, existed in all industrialized nations. Their numbers were far too small to support the revolution that the Communist Manifesto had promised. But the book was still being shared, like a bad cold, a bad virus.
Marxism had a tough time finding a home in places where the industrial world was thriving. But what about the non-industrialized world? In our next and final episode in this series on the revolutions that have shaped our world, we'll visit the largest country on Earth, Mother Russia, where a Marx-influenced revolution set the stage for a global showdown between freedom and control. But before we say goodbye, make sure you take away these 3 lessons. Capitalism, which ran together with the Industrial Revolution, is an economic system where freedom allows everyone to win: buyers and sellers, bosses and workers.
Despite opposition, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution led to better quality of life for people at all levels of society.
Marxism rejects capitalism, believing that everything is a fight for power between oppressed and oppressor, and falsely claimed that industrializing was negative for people.
And as always, it's time to end with a thought-provoking question. What do you think the world would look like without the Industrial Revolution? Let us know in the comments below. I like this music about when it starts kicking it down.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of TBH History for PragerU. Make sure you subscribe and check out our other episodes, as well as part 1 of the Industrial Revolution, which you should watch and should have watched before you watched this. If you're still watching this, as always, we want you to post an emoji, and this time we're gonna have you post a pretzel emoji. And if you can tell us why we want you to post it, we will give you a shout out in the next episode. But until then, it's time for our shout out from last episode. Lim, take over.
All right, it's time for the shout out. Research. Nuno and Ella says, because he puts coal in your stocking, and coal was a big part of the Industrial Revolution. With the Santa Claus emoji at the beginning. Nuno and Ella, congratulations. You win the shout out. Yes. Well done. Well done.
Don't you talk to my baby that way.
Got this nasty stuff on my lips and it's still not keeping my mustache.
What? PPD! PPD! Pick up the lace!
I don't dance. Yes, that was good. Yeah.
Wow!
Sorry, this one.
Hey, are you Buffalo Bill?
So good.